Exploding inequality as the pandemic makes the richest even richer. Business for billionaires is booming while more of the global poor is pushed further into poverty. As leaders convene for the World Economic Forum, we ask what can be done to address the ever-widening wealth gap. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is global inequality. Well, the WEF's annual Davos summit got underway this week, bringing together global leaders, investors, and top-tier business people. COVID-19 meant it was held virtually, but some of the richest participants won't be complaining about the coronavirus. That's because the wealth of the world's richest billionaires has doubled over the course of the pandemic, while 99% of the population has seen its income drop. The gap between rich and poor today is the biggest in living memory. Now, according to Oxfam, more than 160 million people have been forced into poverty during the pandemic. Even if the 10 richest men lost 99% of their wealth, they would still be richer than 99% of the people on this planet. Another recent study suggests global inequality is as bad as it was at the height of Western imperialism in the early 1900s. I'll try to digest these numbers. Today, half of the global population owns just 2% of the world's wealth. 40% holds just under a quarter. And 10% owns 3/4, with half of that in the hands of just the top 1%. And the divide has grown in recent decades. Since 1995, the world's poorest half has stayed just as poor, while the richest multimillionaires have seen their share of global wealth increase even further. So what, if anything, can be done about it? Well, activists on the left of the political spectrum have long called for higher taxes in order to distribute wealth more equitably. And now, even some of the ultra-wealthy agree. More than 100 multimillionaires are asking governments to tax them more. A group calling themselves Patriotic Millionaires published an open letter this week, which read,
"As millionaires, we know that the current tax system is not fair. Most of us can say that while the world has gone through an immense amount of suffering in the last 2 years, we have actually seen our wealth rise during the pandemic. Yet few, if any of us, can honestly say that we pay our fair share in taxes."
So they're calling for an annual wealth tax on individuals worth more than $5 million. They say it would generate $2.5 trillion and theoretically could lift billions out of poverty. Speaking at Davos, the UN Secretary General said an urgent solution to the inequality needs to be found.
Now, at the core of these failures is a global inability to support developing countries in their hour of need, and also a problem of governance for international different systems. Without immediate action to support developing countries, inequalities and poverty will deepen. And this will result in more social unrest and more violence.
So are we moving ever closer to social uprising as inequality grows, or has this simply become our new reality? To debate that and more, I'm joined now from one of the signatories of the Patriotic Millionaires letter, Djaffar Shalchi. He is a founder of Millionaires for Humanity and the Human Act Foundation. He joins us from Copenhagen. From Beirut is Dana Abed. She is the influencing lead at Oxfam in Lebanon. And Vicky Pryce is in London. She is a board member at the Center for Economics and Business Research. Thanks all so much for being with us. Djaffar, I want to start with you because you are unique on this panel, given that you're a very wealthy person actually asking to pay more taxes. Why? Why shouldn't you be able to keep more of the money that you've earned for yourself?
Because I don't want to live in a world where a small group has all the wealth and the rest struggling for under $5, according to Oxfam, nearly more than 300 million people. And that will give us a very unsafe world. And I don't want that for me, my children or my grandchildren, or for anybody else. That's why.
Here's the problem, though. I mean, the numbers are shocking. And yet we see people around the world vote for leaders who don't have a whole lot of sympathy for the poor and don't see the value in government spending their money on the greater good. In the US, for example, I mean, the word socialist is seen by many as an insult. So how do you change the dynamic if people don't believe that help or systemic improvement should come through government and through taxes?
I think the majority of the very wealthy people are living in a bubble and for themselves. They drive in their own jets and they have their own societies that don't really see in their eye what is going on, I think. When we can move forward and tell them about how the situation is and how unsafe world we are towards, and that just a 1 or 2% wealth tax don't hurt them at all, but benefit them first and for all. I think there will be more listening to that, and we can see that in just our initiative that we are calling Millionaires for Humanity, and that we got through with Patriotic Millionaires and put the last letter out that millionaires and billionaires are coming together.
Dana, do you agree with that? And if so, I mean, how do you educate people, as Djaffar was saying?
Well, I definitely agree with what has been said, and in fact, our new Oxfam report shares some very startling facts about inequality, such as the numbers that you've mentioned earlier, or for example, when we think that in the midst of a pandemic, the 10 richest men have seen their wealth double, while 99% of humanity is worse off because of the pandemic. When we think about those numbers, we see how inequality is startling. We see how people are dying because of it. We see how we're all suffering because of an economic system that, well, in plain terms, does not work for everybody, but works for the very few at the top.
Okay, Vicky Pryce, how do you get business to care? Because, you know, let's be honest, a lot of our global society today really worships those successful business people and all the excess that they have. It's not something that's frowned upon and saying, you know, why don't you share more? It's saying, wow, you made it. I'd actually like to be there someday.
Well, generally, entrepreneurship needs to be encouraged. There's no doubt about that. And in theory, we all benefit from this. So the more aspirations there are, then people just do the right thing, if you like, and create, you know, wealth for everybody with a bit of luck. It doesn't always happen like that. But I think it is worth bearing in mind who those people are that we're talking about now. They are normally, you know, with some very small exceptions, heads of companies that have benefited quite substantially from the pandemic. In other words, they've been heads of IT companies involved with Google, Microsoft, Amazon, for example, a huge amount of distribution that was needed during the time of lockdowns when we relied on Amazon, for example, to get things to us. So it is the tech sector that has done very well out of the pandemic, and not just, of course, the people who head those companies, but also the companies themselves in terms of the employees, the profits that have been made, and also, actually, interestingly enough, shareholders. That doesn't detract from the fact that a few individuals have done incredibly well as a result of that. The ones that we're seeing in the pictures that are accompanying what I'm saying right now. And the question is, what do you do about that? Do you resent it? Do you do something about it? The interesting thing is that the tax system should be able to do something about this. And what we find, and I think that's also in the Oxfam report, is that inequalities between countries over the last few decades have actually been reduced. So we no longer have the very, very poor and the very, very rich countries. But what has still been the case is that inequalities within countries, including the developing ones, have increased. So there are loads of rich people at the top, very many people at the bottom, even though the average per capita GDP has improved across most countries. So that's really what needs to be dealt with.
Okay. Vicky, though, what about the argument that the rich, you know, they aren't really as rich as they're portrayed because most of their estimated worth is in stocks and assets that, you know, haven't been cashed in on. So they're still holding this risk that all that value, and as rich as we say they are, all of that could be lost in an instant if there's a market crash or if something goes wrong with the businesses they've invested in. So it's not fair to say they are the richest people because they haven't cashed in on what they have.
in some cases, they have cashed in, of course, as we've seen that happening. And some of them, in fact, have withdrawn from those companies, like Bill Gates, and have been doing quite a lot of positive stuff, if you like, in terms of being involved in charities and in research, scientific and medical research, and so on, which, of course, should be good for all of us. But it is absolutely true that tech companies in particular can be very volatile. The stock market can be very volatile. But a lot of the reasons why we've seen this difference that emerges during periods of pandemics or during periods of crisis is that governments intervene, reduce interest rates very significantly, now at record low levels, even though they're beginning to go up, which means that anyone who has assets or who is asset rich does really well out of that, whereas people who rely on incomes don't. And that's why we've seen that big increase in inequality. And it's not just those people, but it's also homeowners who benefited over people who just rely on having rented accommodation or incomes. So you see that discrepancy arising. And when interest rates start going up, that could indeed be reversed. And I think you're right that there's no guarantee that what we've seen during the pandemic will continue. And also you've got governments which are now quite concerned about the oligopolistic or monopolistic power of some of those corporations and are really seriously looking at how to possibly break them up or be considerably tighter and tougher on their operations.
Okay. Djaffar, go ahead. I saw you had a comment.
Yeah, I'm not quite agreeing with that. It's true that the tech business has gone very well, but myself, I'm in the real estate market, and my wealth has just soared enormously under the pandemic. And let's be honest and call it what it is. We, the millionaires and billionaires, are quite so clever to influence our politicians in actually all the different countries around the globe to benefit what benefit us. Since the trickle-down economic with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, we have seen that doesn't work. I'm just getting richer and the poor getting poorer. We have to get a systematic change here so we don't just get richer and richer. If you just go back 15 years ago, we only had actually 500 billionaires with a total wealth of $3 trillion. Today, that number is 2,600 with a wealth more than $10 trillion. And according to all the reports and Credit Suisse report, you can see that the total wealth of the globe, of our world, is more than 400 trillion. And the top 1% has more than 200 of it. So imagine it's just 1% wealth tax on millionaires will give us more than $2 trillion. And that is actually enough to achieve all our 17 sustainable development goals.
Right.
And that's what we need now. And that's why the United Nations is out now in calling for that.
What worries people, though, Djaffar, I'm going to stay with you, is how those taxes will be distributed. Sorry. Well, you know, we're counting on good governments to do this work, to tax those wealthy people and then distribute that wealth fairly and effectively. Do you, in Denmark, maybe you can count on them to do that, but when you look at the rest of the world, do you worry that it won't be done?
Yeah, I think there's no problem. We have seen it in many organizations like Global Fight Against AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, the Global Alliance Fund, and many others that can solve that. So to achieve a global fund for the SDGs will be no problem. We have the technology to do that. That will not the problem. The problem is the human will, that we don't have the will to do it. And as I said before, just 1% wealth taxes will actually be enough to solve that. So it's not the lack of resources here. And according to OECD's latest report, very powerful report, more than 60% of the people is agreeing on a wealth tax. So we have a huge majority of the normal population in the OECD countries that is going and agreeing with a wealth tax. And last year we saw a global 15% tax on corporations. So why not a 1% wealth tax to achieve our 17 sustainable development goals? And we have to remember that all 193 countries have signed to solve the SDGs and also to get the financing for it. So I think the time is right and the time is now, and time is running out for us.
Okay. So if you believe then, Djaffar, the majority of those polls and that this is what the vast majority of people want, do you fear that we're reaching a tipping point because this kind of inequality is what revolutions in the past have been built on. Are we moving toward that?
Exactly. And that's exactly as people like Warren Buffett is going out many times and he's saying the same. Let's do it now. Let's go out and be a part of the solution before they come and take everything from us. Because I travel a lot and really can see that we are going towards a very unsafe world. And that's why, again, that the Oxfam has shown that in 2013, in just 8 years' time, we will have more than 300 billion people living for about $5. So I think the time is now and we have to move on it.
Dana, I can see you agree. I mean, tell us what worries you most and where on that front.
I mean, on the front of redistribution wealth, I think it should be accompanied as well with redistribution of power. And this is something that we tap into our report as well. So the same way wealth needs to be redistributed, power and representation also needs to be fairer for our society and to build fairer economies, fair economies as well. When we talk about solidarity movements, this is when we talk having the voice of the people being louder and being put at the heart of decision making. And this is what we need to see. No one can ignore or deny the influence that businessmen and the richest have on politicians and have on policies. And this cycle needs to be broken if we want to build a fairer society. We need to put workers in decision making positions. We need to put more women, more members from the minority communities, a better racial and ethnic representation in order to ensure the policies that we have and the system that we have really works for everyone.
Okay. I mean, Dana, there's also the issue, and Oxfam has spoken about this before, about debt cancellation. Let me ask you if you think it really does help, because too often it is political corruption that sentences millions of people to poverty, and forgiving that debt in a sense rewards the very people who've committed that corruption. It perpetuates that dangerous cycle and shows that those who steal can get away with it. You're in Lebanon. People complain about that all the time. How do you address those fundamental issues of corruption stopping any real progress from being made in redistribution of wealth?
I mean, Lebanon is really a textbook example if we're thinking about inequality and having political capture on the country and so on. But what I can say about debt cancellation is that debt on poor countries that are coming from rich countries is actually crippling to any type of reviving the economy or moving forward for a better GDP and enhancing the lives of people. For example, in Lebanon, we've paid over 85% of our income to debt servicing. A cancellation of that sort will help the governments reinvest in infrastructure and institutions that allow people to access their basic rights, and that can also protect countries from going into economic crisis. And that is also a part of redistribution of wealth between countries, because as we saw inequality continuing between countries of the north and countries of the south and different middle and low-income countries versus rich countries, we need to rethink about redistribution wealth between countries as well.
Okay, Vicky, give us an idea from a business perspective, I mean, how that can better be addressed then. Just dealing with corruption in government, trying not to enforce the fact that sometimes corruption pays and instead redirect the money that's lost from by kleptocracies, to give it in a way that can benefit everybody globally.
Well, it's hard, and I think the international financial institutions have a big role to play in that. But I think what is really interesting about the pandemic and how we've all reacted to it is that the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on have changed their views in a way in terms of providing assistance to countries that are in need. So what we've seen is quite a substantial increase in support that's been given to countries that have suffered and haven't got enough money themselves to deal with the national health crisis that they had because of the pandemic. What we've seen is an increase in both loans with few conditions this time, and also grants that have been given to developing countries that have been in greatest need. And I think that's a plus. I think there's been a change of attitude, and therefore being a lot more lenient on the debt, just as we've been hearing, actually would make huge amount of sense. And as a percentage of the overall, it's not huge in the sense that, you know, the world can sustain it, but with some supervision, without any doubt, to erase some of those issues, that the corruption and also taking money out of the country that comes in as aid, that we have seen happen in a number of places, unfortunately. And that's the point that I was making earlier, that within countries, what you've seen is the inequality increasing, if anything, even though the world as a whole has moved forward and the countries as a whole have done better than they would have done without globalization and so on. So it is a big issue that needs to be dealt with, but firms themselves have little ability to influence, except in terms of the way in which they deal with particular countries and the conditions, if you like, that they have internally themselves about doing this, whatever it is that they're doing in terms of business, in the right way with countries that they're associating with. So it is an extra burden, but it is something that is certainly worth bearing in mind. So
Right.
looking forward, I agree that we absolutely need to help those countries move along, and climate change is going to come, which is coming, and they need also a huge amount of extra cash for adaptation that we simply haven't given them. And I think this idea of the wealth tax and redistributing it in relation to adaptation to those countries that need it for climate change is one that has come out of the Oxfam report as well.
Right. I mean, you talk about how these big businesses could better deal with various countries. There's also an issue of how they deal with their employees and wanting to share the wealth of their own prosperity. When we look at a company like Amazon, you know, in the top 3 globally now, what do you wish someone like Jeff Bezos would actually do? Because, you know, he caters to a kind of society. I'll get to you, Djaffar, in just a second. He caters to, you know, an elite that kind of believes, or wants to believe at least, in trickle-down economics, which doesn't essentially work, because one person, no matter how much money they have, will still only need one haircut at a time. They can still only eat really 3 meals a day. And that's the money that actually goes to the middle class. The rest goes to luxury items. It doesn't trickle down. They're buying luxury cars. They're buying yachts, not stuff that really empowers the middle class. So how do you tell those big business leaders that they need to get that money, that profit, to their workers, to the middle class, to help everybody, including them?
It's an incredibly interesting question, and of course one that can't be answered very easily. And yet we had been expecting that the percentage of GDP that would be going to the workers, if you like, would be increasing over time, because what companies like Microsoft, Amazon, and others need is this knowledge that you bring with you. So in other words, the expertise that people have would be rewarded by having a bigger share of the overall cake, if you like. But that hasn't happened. It's been the other way around, and that's the real worry. So what methods are used in a number of places is that you have your employees really become partners in the organization, that they really share in the profits, that they share in how they push the company along. That seems to be a method that works, but so far only up to a point. So I think we need a complete rethink. I think what we heard earlier about empowerment is important, not just for women, but for people who work in those places. And we haven't quite seen that happen. In fact, the opposite seems to have been the case.
Let me get back to Djaffar. I saw you had a comment, especially when I raised Jeff Bezos. I mean, how do you convince a guy like that when everyone's life is better, his life is actually better too?
That's quite easy, actually, because he don't need to give all his wealth away. As you know, he is number 2 in the world, and he believed that he has a project to investigate the stars. But like Elon Musk also said, he also are using a lot of his money on that, and that he's, like I said, only take 1 or 2% of the global GDP. But I will turn it around and say, okay, you also need a few percent of the GDP to solve our 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Why not start there and save our planet first, and then see what we can do to the stars? Because everybody knows that we don't have the technology now. We will maybe have it in about 100, 200 years later, but not now. And at that time, we have destroyed our beautiful planet. So we don't have any planet B. So the plan is to save the human race and our own societies now and then see what we can do. So we have to show some courage and go forward and encourage everybody to do it before it's too late.
Before it's too late, Djaffar, how optimistic are you? How realistically optimistic are you?
I am actually quite optimistic. Since we started 1 year ago with our group called Millionaires for Humanity, we have now hundreds of millionaires and some billionaires on board that want this and can see that we are on the wrong path, actually. So I believe in the great path of love and compassion. And I think that will prevail in the end, and that the humans will come to the sense, especially the super rich, and go forward and show that they are a part of the solution.
Okay, Djaffar, that will have to be the last word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.